As you may recall, the Subaru family moved home quite a few times after leaving the Bowley Mill, due to the fact that they were unable to pay the rent. In 1857, the family were thrown out of their house once again because they were unable to meet the rent. They ended up on the streets. Nobody wanted to know about their plight. Nobody wanted to help them, even though they had helped so many during their time at the Bowley Mill. At that time, the old jail, or Cachot, was being leased by a cousin of Francois. The building had ceased to be a prison around 1824 because the conditions in it at that time were deemed too unhealthy to house prisoners. But in 1857 the Subarus were desperate. With no other choice available, Francois went knocking on his cousin's door. The conditions were appalling. The room was musty and damp. Mildew covered the walls. Rats had moved in. The smell from the dung heap outside the window permeated the dark, filthy hovel, as it was described locally. Saint-Just didn't think it was suitable accommodation for any family, but there were 4 young children about to be left on the streets with no roof over their heads, and so with a heavy heart, he agreed to give the room to the Subaru. Francois, Louise, and their 4 children moved into the tiny room in the Cachot. Installing their belongings didn't take long. Francois worked as a day labourer, hiring the strength of his arms out for a pittance. He also worked from time to time, delivering flour for the baker. But misfortune came his way once again in March 1857, when 2 gendarmes arrived at the Cachot to arrest Francois. 2 sacks of flour had gone missing from the bakery, and all fingers were pointing at the father of 4. Following intensive questioning and a search of the Cachot, Francois was eventually released without charge. News of his accusation of theft had spread quickly, but the news of Francois' innocence, of course, hadn't. Therefore, finding a job became even more difficult for the misfortunate miller. His left eye continued to cause him both physical and psychological pain. He had lost his confidence as well as his vision. He was deemed unemployable by the locals, so Francois used to stay in bed all day to conserve energy. He refused to eat, therefore ensuring that his wife and children had more on their plates. However, when news spread that Francois had taken to his bed instead of earning money to feed his family, his reputation sank even further. The children helped to look after their humble home and also contributed in their small way to the running of the Cachot by gathering twigs, bones, and old pieces of iron which they sold in the second-hand shop. Hunger was commonplace in the Cachot despite their efforts. A story is told of an unknown little boy found scraping wax off the floor of the parish church and eating it, anything to fill his stomach. It was later discovered during the apparitions that this little boy was Bernadette's little brother. We are also told that when Bernadette lived in the Cachot, she used to fill a bowl with water, adding grass in an attempt to make soup. In September 1857, Bernadette went to live with her wet nurse in Bartres, so that the Subaru would have one less mouth to feed. Bernadette returned to Lourdes to the Cachot on the 17th of January 1858. She had pleaded with the parish priest and the nuns who ran the hospice to help her prepare to receive her first Holy Communion. While she returned to the squalor of the Cachot, she returned also to the love and warmth of her family. 11th of February 1858 was a damp, misty morning. The Subaru had no wood left for the fire because they had sold their last log the previous day. Louise wasn't keen, but Bernadette and her sister Toinette, along with their friend Jeanne, begged permission to go looking for some firewood. She eventually conceded, but not before warning Bernadette, who suffered from asthma, to wrap up well and not to get her shoes and socks wet. The girls left the Cachot, crossed the old bridge over the river, and arrived at the prairie, which is now the Rosary Square. Close to where the canal joins the River Gave, Bernadette stopped. This is where she would have to remove her shoes and socks so as not to get them wet when crossing the river. The other 2 girls continued and started to gather sticks and twigs, as well as old bones that had been dumped there by the butchers. As Bernadette bent down to remove her shoes and socks, she heard a sound like a gust of wind. But the trees were not moving. She looked around to see what had made the noise, and in the niche of the rock she saw a bright light. When she studied the light, she saw a beautiful lady dressed in white, and that was the first apparition on the 11th of February 1858. When Bernadette left the Cachot on that cold misty morning, she had no idea what lay ahead of her, and yet it was from this room, home to the poorest of the poor and the lowest of the low, that Bernadette left for the subsequent 17 apparitions, and indeed on several other occasions too, having felt the calling in her heart and knowing that the Lady, the Immaculate Conception, Our Lady of Lourdes, was calling her to the rock of Massabielle.